Sometimes the life you build in solitude is the only one that makes sense. For 40 years, Rowen Maddix has called the deep forests of the Pacific Northwest home, far from the world that once hurt her. She knows these mountains better than anyone, every trail, every hidden valley. Her German shepherd, Brisk, is her only companion. One morning, Brisk leads her to something she's never seen before, a massive stone sphere, perfectly round, half buried in moss. It hums under her palm. It's cracked down the middle like something trying to break free. Rowen's instinct tells her to cut it open. What she finds inside will change everything she thought she knew about this land and her own past. What was hidden in that stone? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The cabin stood where it had always stood, tucked into a fold of Douglas firs so old. They remembered when this land had different names. Rowen had built most of it herself over the years, replacing rotted boards, reinforcing the foundation, adding a proper chimney that drew smoke cleanly into the mountain air. It wasn't much. One main room with a sleeping loft, a kitchen area along the west wall, a wood stove that worked harder in winter than she did, but it was hers. More importantly, it was far enough from everything else that she could pretend the rest of the world had simply stopped existing. She stood on the porch now, coffee steaming in her hands, watching the forest wake up. 63 years old, and her body still moved like it belonged out here. Lean and weathered, muscles built from decades of hiking steep terrain with a full pack. Her hair, once dark brown, had gone silver years ago. She kept it in a long braid, down her back, practical and out of the way. Her face showed every year she'd lived, lines around her eyes, from squinting at distant ridges, deeper creases around her mouth from a lifetime of reading the weather in the wind. Brisk sat beside her, alert and patient. The German shepherd was 7 now, still in his prime, still the best tracking dog she'd ever worked with. His ears swiveled constantly, cataloguing sounds she'd never hear: the rustle of a squirrel 200 yards away, the distant crack of a branch under a deer's hoof, the particular flutter of a raven's wings versus a hawk's. He was more than a companion. He was her partner, her early warning system, and on the coldest nights, the warm weight against her back that reminded her she wasn't entirely alone. "Going to be a clear day," she said to him, though he already knew. He always knew. She'd come to these mountains 40 years ago with nothing but a backpack, a broken heart, and a rage so deep it felt like drowning. The world had used her up the army first, then the man she'd trusted, then the so-called friends who'd chosen sides and left her standing in the wreckage of a life she'd thought was solid. She'd been 23 and stupid enough to believe that loyalty meant something. By the time she understood how thoroughly she'd been betrayed, there was nothing left to go back to, so she'd gone forward instead, deep into the Cascade Range, following trails that petered out into game paths, then following the game paths until those disappeared too. She'd found this place by accident, or so she'd thought at the time. A small valley where a creek ran year-round, sheltered from the worst of the winter storms, close enough to an old logging road that she could haul supplies in twice a year, but far enough that nobody stumbled across her by chance. The first winter had nearly killed her. She'd been too proud to go back, too stubborn to admit she'd made a mistake. She'd learned to trap, to fish through ice, to make her food stores stretch impossibly thin. By spring, she was 20 pounds lighter and considerably smarter. She'd also discovered something unexpected. She was good at this. Better than good. The skills the army had drilled into her: navigation, survival, tactical thinking, translated perfectly to living off the grid. And the skills she'd learned from her grandmother, half-forgotten childhood lessons about reading, sign, and understanding the patterns of the wild, came flooding back like muscle memory. Her grandmother, Rowen hadn't thought about her in years. But lately, the old woman's face kept surfacing in her mind. A Lumi elder who'd married outside the tribe and lived her whole life walking between two worlds, never quite belonging to either. She died when Rowen was in her early 30s, and they'd drifted apart long before that, separated by Rowen's deployment overseas and then by her own self-imposed exile. But before all that, when Rowen was just a girl, her grandmother had taken her to special places, hidden caves with strange markings, groves where the trees grew in perfect circles, cliffsides where you could hear sounds that had no source, the old places, her grandmother had called them, where the earth remembers things people have forgotten. At the time, Rowen had thought it was just poetry, the kind of mystical talk elders used to make ordinary things seem important. Now, living in these mountains, she wasn't so sure. There were places out here that felt different. Places where your compass needles spun uselessly, where electronics failed for no reason, where the air itself seemed to press against you with an almost physical weight. She'd learned to avoid them, mostly. They made Brisk nervous, and anything that made Brisk nervous was worth taking seriously. She finished her coffee and went inside to check her schedule. 3 clients this month, all experienced hunters who'd paid well for her services as a guide. She didn't need the money. Her needs were minimal and her savings still held out, but the work kept her skills sharp and gave her an excuse to move through the backcountry legally. The Forest Service left her alone as long as she maintained her wilderness guide certification and didn't cause problems. It was an arrangement that suited everyone. The cabin's interior was spare but organized. Everything had its place, and everything was maintained with almost military precision. Her rifles hung on pegs above the door, cleaned and oiled. Her packs were staged by the entrance, ready to grab depending on whether she was going out for a day, a week, or longer. Along one wall she'd built shelves for her supplies, canned goods, dried beans, rice, salt, coffee, things that lasted. On another shelf sat her books, most of them field guides and technical manuals, but a few novels she'd read so many times the spines had cracked and the pages had gone soft. And there, tucked in the corner, was the trunk that had belonged to her grandmother. Rowen hadn't opened it in years. It contained the old woman's personal effects, a few pieces of jewelry, some photographs, letters written in a language Rowen couldn't read, and a leather journal filled with sketches and notes about plants and animals, and scattered throughout, cryptic observations about the old places and the things that sleep. Rowen had flipped through it once or twice, more out of nostalgia than real interest. Her grandmother's handwriting was difficult, a mix of English and lummy words, and sometimes just symbols that might have been abbreviations or might have been something else entirely. It had seemed like the confused writings of an old woman losing her clarity, and Rowen had put it away, uncomfortable with the idea that her grandmother's mind had been failing at the end. But lately, she'd been thinking about that journal again. She walked to the trunk now, running her hand over the weathered wood. Not today, she decided. She had work to do, firewood to split, a section of the porch railing that needed replacing, gear to prep for next week's client. The past could wait. Brisk's bark shattered her thoughts, not his alert bark or his warning bark, but something else, excited, urgent, confused. She grabbed her rifle by instinct and was out the door in seconds. The dog stood at the edge of the clearing, staring into the trees, his whole body rigid with attention. When Rowen approached, he looked back at her, then at the forest, then back again. The message was clear. "You need to see this." "Show me," she said quietly. He took off at a trot, not his usual loping run, but a careful, deliberate pace that said he wanted her close. She followed, rifle held loosely across her chest, eyes scanning the terrain automatically. They were heading northeast, upslope, into an area she knew well. Nothing out here but old-growth forest and a few rocky outcroppings where cougars sometimes denned. No reason for Brisk to be this worked up, unless she saw it before she understood what she was seeing. The thing was massive, easily the size of a delivery truck, half buried in the forest floor and covered in decades, maybe centuries of moss and ferns. But the shape was wrong for a boulder. Too perfect, too smooth. It was a sphere, or near enough, and even through the thick vegetation, she could see that its surface wasn't natural stone but something else. Something manufactured. Rowen stopped 20 feet away, her heart hammering. Brisk sat down beside her, whining softly in the back of his throat. She approached slowly, rifle still ready even though she had no idea what she'd be shooting at. Up close, the object was even stranger. The moss pulled away easily in her hands, revealing a surface that was neither rock nor metal, but something in between, smooth, faintly warm to the touch, and marked with fine hairline cracks that formed an intricate web across its surface. And it was humming. Not loudly, and not a sound exactly, but a vibration she felt more than heard. It travelled up through her palm, into her arm, settling somewhere behind her sternum, like the low note of a bell that never quite faded. "What the hell?" she whispered. Brisk whined again, pressing against her leg. She walked around the thing slowly, running her hands over its surface, tracing the cracks with her fingertips. The pattern wasn't random, she could see that now. The cracks formed deliberate lines, almost like seams, as if this thing had been designed to come apart. In the center of what she arbitrarily thought of as its north face, the cracks converged in a circular pattern, and there, just barely visible through the remaining moss, was something that might have been a symbol, or might have been just an irregularity in the surface. She stood back, breathing hard, trying to make sense of what she was looking at. A sphere this size, this perfect, couldn't be natural. But if it was made, who made it? And when? And why bury it here, in the middle of nowhere, where nobody would ever find it, except she had found it? Or rather, Brisk had. She thought about her grandmother's journal, sitting in its trunk back at the cabin. Thought about the old places and the things that sleep. Thought about stories told to a little girl who hadn't understood their importance. A chill ran down her spine that had nothing to do with the morning air. She needed to think, needed to research, to understand what this was before she did anything stupid. But even as she thought it, she knew she was going to come back, knew she was going to figure out how to open it. The need was already there, settling into her bones like hunger, like thirst, like something that had been waiting 40 years for exactly this moment. "Come on," she said to Brisk, her voice rougher than she intended. "Let's go home." But as they walked back through the forest, she could still feel it, that faint vibration, that low, persistent hum, calling to something deep inside her that she hadn't known was listening. The forest around her seemed different. Now, not threatening, exactly, but watching, aware, as if the trees themselves knew something had changed, that a door long closed was beginning to open, and there was no way to know what would come through. By the time they reached the cabin, the sun had climbed above the ridge, spilling golden light across the clearing. It should have felt warm and safe. Instead, Rowen stood on her porch with her rifle still in hand, staring back toward the northeast, toward the thing waiting in the forest, and felt the weight of a question she couldn't yet answer. What was it? And why, after 40 years of careful solitude, did it feel like it had been waiting specifically for her? 3 days passed before Rowen went back to the stone. 3 days of telling herself to be smart, to be cautious, to treat this like any other unknown in the wilderness, observe from a distance, gather information, don't engage until you understand the risk. But on the 4th morning, she woke before dawn, with the dream still clinging to her, her grandmother's voice, speaking words she couldn't quite remember, and the sensation of something opening, unfolding, releasing. She lay in the darkness of her loft, listening to Brisk's steady breathing from his bed below, and knew the waiting was over. She packed carefully: first aid kit, water, headlamp, spare batteries, her field journal and a good camera, and tools, a pry bar, a small sledgehammer, a rock saw she'd used maybe twice in all her years out here. She didn't know what the stone would take to open, but she'd start conservative and work her way up. The hike took 40 minutes at a steady pace. The forest was quiet this morning, mist hanging in the hollows, the air cool and heavy with moisture. Brisk ranged ahead, but not far, and she noticed he gave the stone a wide berth when they arrived, settling himself a good 30 feet away and watching with his ears pinned back. In the growing light, the stone looked less mysterious and more impossible. No weathering she could identify, no lichen growing on it, though lichen covered every other surface out here. And that hum, that damned persistent vibration that she could feel in her teeth now that she was close. She photographed it from every angle, documenting the crack patterns, the faint symbols, the way it sat partially embedded in the earth, as if it had been here long enough for the ground to claim it. Then she set down her pack and picked up the pry bar. The first crack she tried was the widest, running almost a foot across the stone's surface. She wedged the pry bar in carefully and pulled. Nothing. She tried another crack, then another. The stone might as well have been solid for all the movement she got. She sat back on her heels, breathing hard, and really looked at the pattern of cracks. They all converged at that central point on the north face, where the symbol was. She brushed away the last of the moss there, revealing the marking clearly for the first time. It wasn't a symbol she recognized from any language or culture she'd studied. 3 concentric circles with lines radiating outward, and at the center, something that might have been a star or might have been something else, a representation of an explosion maybe, or a flower opening, or both. She traced it with her fingertip, and the stone pulsed. It wasn't her imagination. The vibration increased for just a moment, a throb of energy that traveled up her arm and made her vision blur at the edges. When it passed, she was breathing hard, her hand still pressed against the symbol. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay, I hear you." She picked up the rock saw. If this thing wanted to be opened, she'd open it. But carefully, methodically. She positioned the blade at the widest crack and began to cut. The saw bit into the surface more easily than she'd expected. The material wasn't rock, it felt more like cutting through very dense ceramic or maybe very old concrete that had begun to crystallize. Dust fell away in a fine powder that caught the light strangely, glittering with flecks that looked almost metallic. She worked for 2 hours, following the crack line, deepening the cut. Brisk watched from his position in the trees, occasionally whining but never approaching. The forest around them grew quieter as she worked, until the only sounds were the rasp of the saw and her own breathing. When the blade finally broke through, she felt it a sudden give, a rush of air from inside the stone that smelled of nothing and everything, cold and old and utterly foreign. She pulled back, heart hammering, and waited. Nothing happened. She set down the saw and picked up the pry bar again. This time, when she wedged it into the cut, the stone moved. Just a fraction, but enough. She worked the bar deeper, leveraging her weight against it, and with a sound like a long-held breath being released, the stone opened. Not all the way. Just enough. A gap of 6 inches, running the length of the cut she'd made, and from within light, faint, blue-green, pulsing in rhythm with that ever-present hum. Rowen's hands shook as she reached for her headlamp. She didn't need it yet, but having it ready felt important, like maintaining some kind of protocol in a situation where all her training had become useless. She leaned forward, peering into the gap. The interior of the stone was hollow. She'd expected that somehow. But what she hadn't expected was how hollow the walls couldn't have been more than a few inches thick, which meant most of this massive sphere was empty space. And that space was filled with structures, not filled, exactly, lined. The inside surface of the stone was covered in geometric formations that looked like crystals, but grew in patterns that were too regular, too deliberate. They caught the blue-green light and refracted it, creating a dizzying effect like looking into a kaleidoscope. And between the formations, running, in channels across the interior surface, were what looked like veins, organic, pulsing with that same light, connected to something at the center of the chamber. Rowen couldn't see the center clearly through the gap, but she could see enough. There was something there. Something dark and organic-looking, suspended in the middle of the hollow space, with those crystal vein channels all connecting to it like roots to a seed. her breath fogged in the cold air that seeped from the opening. She had to document this, had to photograph it before she did anything else. She reached for her camera with trembling hands. That's when the memory hit her. Not her memory. She knew that immediately. The images flooding her mind belonged to someone, something else. Forest. But not this forest. Trees that were taller, stranger, with bark that rippled like water, and leaves that weren't leaves but something that moved on its own. Sky that was the wrong color, more purple than blue, with 3 moons visible in daylight, and figures moving between the trees. Not human, not quite. Tall and thin, and moving in a way that hurt to watch, because her brain kept trying to interpret their motion as something familiar and failing. They were building something. She could see them working, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, creating these spheres, filling them with the vision fractured. She was back in her own forest, her own time, on her hands and knees next to the open stone, gasping for air. Brisk was beside her now, pressing against her, whining urgently. She wrapped her arms around him and held on while the world stopped spinning. When she could think again, she looked back at the gap in the stone. The blue-green light was brighter now, pulsing faster. And from deep inside, she heard something that might have been a sound or might have been a vibration too low for her ears to properly register. Whatever was in there was responding to being opened. And whatever had just shown her that vision, that impossible glimpse of another time, another place, wanted her to understand something. This wasn't archaeological. This wasn't even terrestrial. This was something else entirely. She should close it, should seal it back up and walk away and pretend she'd never seen it. Every instinct she'd honed over 40 years of surviving in the wilderness was screaming at her to recognize a threat when she saw one. But she didn't close it. Instead, she picked up her camera and started taking photographs. Clear, detailed images of the interior structures, the crystal formations, the organic-looking mass at the center. Evidence. Proof. Something to help her make sense of what she'd found. Because one thing was clear now. This wasn't just about her. This stone, buried here for who knew how long, was part of something larger. And she was standing at the edge of a truth that would change everything she thought she understood about the world. She just had to decide what to do about it. The forest around her had gone completely silent. Not the peaceful quiet of a winter morning, but the oppressive silence that came when every living thing in range recognized the presence of a predator. She looked around slowly, rifle in reach, but saw nothing. Brisk's growl was so low she felt it more than heard it. His eyes were fixed on the stone, on the gap she'd created, and every hair along his spine stood rigid. "I know," she whispered to him. "I know." She backed away slowly, gathering her tools, her camera, her pack. The stone sat there in its bed of moss and ferns, that gap in its side leaking blue-green light into the morning air and humming its endless patient song. By the time she reached the tree line, she was running. For 3 days, Rowen didn't leave her cabin. She told herself it was caution, that she needed time to process what she'd seen, to research, to think. But the truth was simpler and more frightening. She was afraid to go back. She'd seen things in the army that had tested her nerve, had been in situations where the wrong choice meant people died. This was beyond the scope of anything her training or experience had prepared her for. This was walking into a room where the rules of physics might not apply, where her understanding of reality itself could be called into question. So instead, she studied her photographs. She'd printed them on her small portable printer, spread them across her table in careful sequence. The exterior of the stone, the crack patterns, the symbol at its center, and then the interior shots, those crystalline formations, those vein-like channels pulsing with light, that dark organic mass suspended in the middle of it all. She pulled out her grandmother's trunk on the second night, set it on the table and opened it slowly, as if the old woman's ghost might rise up in reproach for disturbing her things after so many years of neglect. The journal was near the bottom, wrapped in oilcloth that had gone stiff with age. Rowen unwrapped it carefully and opened to the first page. Her grandmother's handwriting stared back at her, cramped and careful. The first few entries were mundane observations about plant growth, weather patterns, animal behavior. The things you'd expect from someone who spent a lot of time in the forest. But about 20 pages in, the tone shifted. "Went to the old place today," her grandmother had written, "the one where the compass fails. Found new markings on the stones. They're glowing now, faint but steady. Marcus says I'm imagining it, that old stones don't glow. But Marcus doesn't have the gift. He doesn't feel what I feel when I stand in those places. The earth is trying to tell us something. It's been trying for generations, but we stopped listening." Rowen flipped forward, scanning entries. Her grandmother had documented dozens of old places throughout the Cascades and beyond. Gave them names: the Singing, Cave, the Circle Grove, the Stone That Waits. Each entry included sketches, and as Rowen studied them, her stomach tightened. The symbols. They were here. Not exact matches, but similar enough that the family resemblance was unmistakable. Circles and radiating lines. Geometric patterns that hurt to look at if you stared too long. And notes beside them in her grandmother's hand. Protective marks. Warnings. Maps. She found the entry she was looking for 40 pages in. Her grandmother had drawn a rough map of the region with 7 locations marked. One of them, in the far northeast corner, was labeled simply, "The Sleeper." Rowen's hands trembled as she compared the map to her mental geography of these mountains. The marked location was close, maybe 2 miles from where she'd found the stone. Close enough that it could be the same site if her grandmother's map-making had been even slightly imprecise. Which meant her grandmother had known something was out there, buried and waiting. Had known, and Rowen flipped to the end of the journal. The last dozen pages were harder to read, the handwriting shakier, some words crossed out or written over. Her grandmother's final entries, made in the weeks before her death. "I can feel them waking," one entry read. "Not yet, not soon, but the time is coming. The markers are changing, growing warmer. The old agreements are weakening. Someone will have to make the choice when the time comes. Someone will have to decide." And then, 3 pages from the end, "Rowen has the gift, though she doesn't know it. She has my blood, my bones, my burden. I'm sorry, child, I'm so sorry. But you're the only one left who can." Rowen closed the journal and sat in the darkness of her cabin, breathing slowly, deliberately, fighting the panic that threatened to overwhelm her. Her grandmother had known and had chosen not to tell her. Had let Rowen run away to these mountains, or had she? Had guided her here. Used stories and childhood conditioning to plant the seed that would eventually grow into this exact moment, Rowen sitting alone in a cabin 2 miles from an impossible stone that had been waiting for her all along. She thought about the vision she'd had when she opened the stone, those alien figures building the spheres. Filling them with what? She couldn't remember clearly now. The memory was already fading, the way dreams fade, leaving only impressions and unease. But one thing was clear. Her grandmother had believed these stones were important, believed they needed to be protected or monitored or something. And now that responsibility had fallen to Rowen, whether she wanted it or not. She stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the forest was dark under a new moon. But in the direction of the stone, she thought she could see a faint glow on the horizon. Probably her imagination. Probably just the reflection of starlight on low clouds. Probably. Brisk whined from his bed, looking at her with eyes that reflected the lamplight. He'd been anxious since they'd returned from the stone, jumped at sounds that normally wouldn't bother him, refused to go more than a few feet from the cabin unless she insisted. "I know," she told him. "I feel it too." The forest was changing. She'd noticed it over the past 3 days. The birds were gone, not just fewer, but completely absent. No ravens, no jays, no chickadees. The squirrels had vanished. Even the insects seemed to have retreated, and twice now she'd woken in the night to a sound like thunder, except the sky was clear and the sound came from underground. The stone was doing something. Its opening had triggered a response, either in the stone itself or in the land around it, and that response was accelerating. She went back to the table and studied her grandmother's map again. 7 marked locations. If the one near her was indeed the sleeper, what were the other 6? Were there more stones out there, buried and waiting? And if so, were they all waking up? She needed more information, needed to understand what her grandmother had known and how she'd learned it. But most of the people who might have those answers were dead, her grandmother's friends, her relatives, the elders who would have shared the old stories. Except, Rowen pulled out her satellite phone. She'd kept it for emergencies, paying the subscription year after year, even though she'd only used it a handful of times. Now, she scrolled through the contacts until she found the one she wanted. Thomas Pine, her grandmother's nephew, who would be in his 70s now if he was still alive. She hesitated. Once she made this call, once she started asking questions, she'd be opening a door that couldn't be closed. Word would spread. People would want to know why she was suddenly interested in her grandmother's old stories after decades of silence. But what choice did she have? The stone was there. It was open. Something was happening whether she liked it or not, and she needed to understand what before it got worse. She pressed the call button and listened to the satellite connection ping and hiss as it found a signal. 3 rings. 4. She was about to hang up when a voice answered, rough with age and sleep. "Hello?" "Thomas," Rowen said. "This is Rowen Maddix. I'm sorry to call so late, but I need to talk to you about my grandmother, about the old places. I found something in the mountains, and I think it's one of the things she was trying to protect." There was a long silence on the other end. Then, "Where are you?" "In the Cascades, northeast range, past the old logging roads." Another pause. When Thomas spoke again, his voice was different, careful, weighted. "You opened it, didn't you? You found one of the sleepers and you opened it." "Yes." "God help us," Thomas whispered, "after all these years. We thought there was more time. We thought—" He cut himself off. "Don't go. Back there. Do you hear me? Whatever you do, don't go back. I'll make some calls. We'll figure out what to do." "Thomas, what are they? What did my grandmother know?" "Not over the phone," he said. "Some things can't be said that way. But Rowen, your grandmother died trying to keep those things sealed. If you've opened one, you've started something that can't be stopped. The others will wake now, all of them. And when they do—" The line went dead. Rowen stared at the phone. The connection had simply dropped, which happened sometimes out here, but the timing felt wrong, felt deliberate. She tried calling back. The number rang and rang, but no one answered. Outside, in the darkness, something in the forest screamed. Not an animal sound, not anything she'd ever heard before. Brisk was on his feet, hackles raised, a low growl building in his chest. And from the direction of the stone, that faint glow was definitely brighter now. Rowen didn't sleep that night. She sat at her table with her rifle across her lap and her grandmother's journal open in front of her, reading by lamplight, while Brisk paced the cabin floor and the forest outside made sounds that forests shouldn't make. At dawn, she made a decision. She went to the trunk and emptied it completely. Her grandmother's jewelry, simple pieces, silver and turquoise. The photographs, most of them faded beyond recognition. Letters, tied in bundles, the paper gone brittle with age. She set them all aside carefully and then felt along the bottom of the trunk for the seam she'd noticed years ago but never investigated. Her fingers found the catch. The false bottom lifted easily, revealing a shallow compartment beneath. Inside was a leather pouch, a folded piece of paper that turned out to be a larger, more detailed version of the map in the journal, and something wrapped in cloth that felt cool and smooth under her fingers. She unwrapped it slowly. A locket, copper rather than silver, tarnished dark with age. It was heavier than it should have been for its size, and when she opened it, her breath caught. Inside, where you'd expect to find a photograph or a lock of hair, there was a small fragment of crystalline material. Blue-green, glowing faintly, exactly like what she'd seen inside the stone. Rowen's hands shook as she held it up to the light. The fragment was no larger than her thumbnail, but it pulsed with that same internal luminescence, that same sense of contained energy. And looking at it, she felt that same pull, the sensation of something calling to something deep in her bones. Her grandmother had carried a piece of the stone with her, had kept it close enough to wear against her skin, which meant she hadn't just known about these things, she'd interacted with them directly, had taken samples, had studied them in ways Rowen was only beginning to understand. She set the locket down carefully and unfolded the map. It was hand-drawn but precise, showing a much larger area than the journal's rough sketch. The 7 marked locations were spread across 3 states, Washington, Oregon, Idaho, in a pattern that formed an irregular heptagon when you connected them. Each location had a name written in her grandmother's careful script: the sleeper, the singer, the watcher, the dreamer, the builder, the speaker, the keeper, and beside each name, a date. Not a historical date, but a future one, or what had been future when her grandmother wrote them. Rowen's blood ran cold as she read them. The first date, beside the sleeper, was last month. Her grandmother had predicted this, had known somehow when each of these sites would become active. And the dates grew closer together after the first. The next one was in 2 weeks, then another week after that, then days, then all within a 48-hour period. Whatever was happening, it was accelerating toward something. A convergence, a synchronization. She turned her attention to the leather pouch. Inside were several items wrapped individually in oilcloth. She laid them out one by one. A knife with a blade that looked like obsidian but wasn't. When she held it up, it caught the light strangely, seeming to absorb it rather than reflect it. A small glass vial filled with dark powder. A bundle of dried herbs she didn't recognize. And a piece of paper with instructions written in her grandmother's hand. If the sleeper wakes before its time, the paper read, use these to seal the breach. Cut your palm with the blade, mix your blood with the powder, burn the herbs and speak the words. It will hold for a time, but not forever. Nothing holds forever. I'm sorry, child. I hoped you'd never need this. But if you're reading it, then hope has failed us both. Below the instructions were words in a language Rowen didn't know. Phonetic spellings suggested how to pronounce them, but their meaning was lost to her. She sat back, overwhelmed. Her grandmother had left her tools. Instructions. A way to at least attempt to control what was happening, but also a clear message. This was temporary, a stopgap, not a solution. The real question was why? Why seal them at all if they were going to wake eventually? What was the point of delaying the inevitable? Unless the timing mattered. Unless there was a difference between these things, waking according to schedule and waking prematurely. Her grandmother's dates suggested a natural progression, a sequence that was supposed to unfold over months. But if Rowen had disrupted that by opening the stone too early. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. Brisk lifted his head, watching her. We have to go back, she said to him. We have to see how bad it is. The hike was different this time. The forest felt empty in a way that went beyond the absence of animals. It felt hollow, as if the life had been drained from it or driven away. The undergrowth that had been green and vital just days ago looked withered. Some of the smaller plants were actually dying, their leaves brown and curled, and it was warmer. The temperature rose with each step she took toward the stone, until she was sweating despite the cool October morning. When she reached the site, she stopped and stared. The gap she'd cut had widened, Not by much, maybe another 6 inches, but enough to be obvious. And the light leaking from inside was brighter, more active, pulsing in patterns that almost looked like communication. The blue-green glow illuminated the clearing, giving everything an underwater quality that made her eyes hurt. The ground around the stone had changed too. The moss was dead, blackened and crumbling. The ferns had wilted, and in a circle roughly 20 feet in diameter, centered on the stone, the earth itself looked different, darker, denser, as if it was being transformed into something else. Rowen approached slowly, every instinct screaming at her to run. Up close, the humming was louder, resonating in her chest like a second heartbeat. The vein-like channels inside were more visible now, more active, pulsing with light that traveled from the central mass outward to the walls in regular waves. And the mass itself had changed. It was larger, more defined. She could see structure now, segmentation, branching, something that looked disturbingly organic, not plant-like, not animal-like. Something else. It was growing. She pulled out the knife her grandmother had left her. The obsidian that wasn't obsidian felt right in her hand, balanced and purposeful. She cut her palm quick, clean, professional. The pain was sharp, but manageable. She'd had worse. The blood welled dark in the morning light. She mixed it with the powder from the vial, creating a paste that felt warm and slightly gritty. Then she took out the herbs and her lighter. The herbs caught quickly, producing a smoke that smelled of sage and something else, something sharp and acrid that made her eyes water. She held the burning bundle in one hand and the blood powder mixture in the other, and began to read the words her grandmother had written. The syllables felt wrong in her mouth, angular and harsh. But as she spoke them, something changed. The stone's humming shifted frequency. The light inside flickered, and when she pressed the blood mixture against the gap she'd cut, smearing it across the opening, the stone responded. The gap began to close. Not quickly, and not completely, but enough. The crystalline structures inside retracted slightly. The pulsing slowed. The temperature in the clearing dropped by several degrees. When it was done, Rowen stepped back, breathing hard. The gap was still there, but narrower. And the mixture she'd applied had hardened into something like resin, sealing the crack she'd made. For now, she looked down at her bleeding palm and understood what her grandmother had tried to tell her. This was the burden. Not just knowledge of these stones, but the responsibility to control them, to keep them sealed when they tried to wake too soon. And the price of that responsibility, paid in blood and sacrifice. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. A text from Thomas Pine, finally getting through. Don't try to seal it alone. Dangerous, help coming, 3 days. 3 days. She looked at the stone, at the temporary seal already showing hairline cracks, and knew 3 days might be too long. But she'd done what she could, given herself time to understand, to prepare. She wrapped her hand in a clean bandage and headed back toward the cabin, Brisk close at her side. Behind her the stone hummed its patient, hungry song, and waited. The drone crashed into Rowen's clearing on the second morning after she'd sealed the stone. She was splitting firewood when she heard it, a high-pitched whine that cut through the forest silence, followed by the unmistakable sound of something mechanical, losing altitude fast. It hit the ground 30 feet from her cabin, tearing through branches and gouging a line in the moss before coming to rest against the base of a cedar. Brisk barked once, sharp and aggressive, and Rowen grabbed her rifle before approaching. The drone was expensive, military-grade or close to it. Quadcopter design, matte black body, camera mounted on a gimbal underneath. The propellers had shattered on impact, but the body was mostly intact. And still active, she could see a red light blinking on its underside. She should have left it alone, should have let whoever owned it come looking for their lost equipment. But curiosity and caution made uncomfortable bedfellows, and she needed to know who was flying surveillance drones over her territory. The memory card was standard micro SD, easy to pop out. She took it back to the cabin and plugged it into her laptop. The files loaded slowly, dozens of video clips and hundreds of still images. What she saw made her stomach drop. The footage showed systematic scanning of the entire region, not just her area, but miles of forest, mapped in a grid pattern with GPS coordinates burned into each frame. And the camera wasn't just recording visible light, there were thermal overlays showing heat signatures and some kind of spectral analysis that highlighted anomalies. The stone showed up clearly in the thermal imaging, a bright spot of heat, much warmer than the surrounding terrain, and in the spectral images it practically glowed, standing out like a beacon against the normal background radiation of the forest. They knew. Someone knew exactly where it was and had been monitoring it long enough to map its thermal signature. She clicked through the files until she found metadata. The drone was registered to a company called TerraVault Industries. She typed the name into her browser and waited while the satellite connection crawled through the search. The results made her blood run cold. TerraVault specialized in geological anomaly detection and resource extraction. Their website was professional, corporate, full of stock photos and vague language about sustainable development and next-generation mining techniques. But when she dug deeper, following links to news articles and investor reports, a different picture emerged. TerraVault had a history of acquiring mineral rights on indigenous lands, had been involved in several lawsuits regarding environmental damage, and most concerning, they'd been quietly buying up property throughout the Pacific Northwest over the past 5 years, always in remote areas, always through shell companies, and always in places that, when she cross-referenced them with her grandmother's map, matched the locations of the 7 stones almost exactly. They weren't just looking for her stone, they were looking for all of them, and they'd been preparing for this for years. She clicked through more search results and found conspiracy forums discussing TerraVault. Most of it was the usual internet. Paranoia claims about secret government contracts, suppressed technology, people who'd investigated the company and then disappeared. She was about to dismiss it as noise when one post caught her attention. A user named Whistlewind had written, "My uncle worked for TerraVault 6 years ago. Geologist, brought in for what he thought was a rare Earth survey. What they actually wanted him to analyze was organic material encased in crystalline structures they'd found at depths that shouldn't contain any biological remains. He tried to publish his findings. Company shut him down with an NDA and threats. He's been terrified to talk about it since, but he told me this much. Whatever they found wasn't from Earth, and they wanted to learn how to open it." The post was 3 years old. Rowen tried to follow up, to find more from Whistlewind, but the account had been deleted. She sat back, thinking hard. If TerraVault had been studying these stones for years, they knew things she didn't, understood things her grandmother might have kept secret, and if they wanted to open them, her phone rang. Not a text this time, but an actual call, which was unusual enough to be alarming. She answered. "Hello?" Static. Then a woman's voice, professional but with an edge of urgency. "Miss Maddix, this is Dr. Lydia Chen. I'm a colleague of Thomas Pine. He asked me to reach out to you regarding a matter of extreme importance." Rowen's grip tightened on the phone. "I'm listening. Thomas told me you've had contact with one of the sites. Is that correct?" "Yes, Miss Maddix. I need you to be very careful how you answer this next question. Have you noticed any corporate activity in your area? Drones, helicopters, ground personnel?" Rowen looked at the crashed drone sitting on her table. "Yes." A long pause. "Then we're running out of time. TerraVault has been monitoring all 7 sites for years. They know about the awakening cycle. They've been waiting for the first site to activate so they could study the process. But what they don't understand, what they refuse to believe, is that opening these sites prematurely could be catastrophic." "Why?" Rowen asked. "What's really inside them?" "The truth?" Chen's voice dropped. "We don't fully know. Your grandmother and the elders who came before her called them refugees, beings from somewhere else, another world, another dimension, another time. They were placed in stasis here as a protective measure, but their biology, their consciousness, it's fundamentally incompatible with our reality. When they wake naturally, according to the proper sequence, there's a protocol that manages the transition, but if they're forced awake, if someone disrupts the sequence, what happens? The interface breaks down. Their consciousness bleeds into our world without proper containment. People near the sites experience hallucinations, psychological breaks, physical symptoms we can't explain, and the sites themselves become unstable, start transforming the surrounding environment. We've seen it happen once before, in 1952, when a survey team accidentally damaged one of the sites. The containment failed. 7 people died, and we had to evacuate a 50-mile radius. It took years to seal it again. Rowen thought about the vision she'd experienced, those alien figures moving in ways that hurt to watch. I opened one of the sites, she admitted, just a small gap, but I sealed it again using instructions my grandmother left. Silence on the other end. Then, when? 3 days ago. God. Chen's voice was tight. Miss Maddix, that seal won't hold. It's a temporary measure at best, and now that you've opened it, the synchronization process has started. All 7 sites will begin to activate in sequence, but faster than they should. We need to get you out of there and seal that site properly before TerraVault arrives. They're already here, Rowen said, looking at the drone. Or they will be, soon. Then we're too late for extraction. Listen carefully. You need to maintain that seal as long as possible. Every hour you buy us is time we can use to prepare proper containment. But don't engage with TerraVault directly. They have resources, legal backing, and they're not above using force to secure what they want. What do they want? The same thing everyone wants when they find something they don't understand, Chen said. They want to weaponize it, control it. They think they can harness whatever consciousness is trapped in those stones, use it for communications, for processing power, for God knows what else. They don't care that it would kill the beings inside. Don't care that the interface could corrupt anyone exposed to it. They just see potential profit. Rowen looked out her window, toward the direction of the stone. How long until help arrives? Thomas is coordinating with others from the Guardian families. We're mobilizing everyone we can, but we're scattered. 3 days minimum. Can you hold out that long? I don't know, Rowen said honestly, but I'll try. One more thing, Chen said. Your grandmother left instructions for sealing the sites, but she also left instructions for destroying them if sealing fails. Do you have access to those protocols? Rowen thought about the pouch from the trunk. She hadn't emptied it completely. I think so. Good, because if TerraVault breaches that site and breaks the containment, destruction might be our only option. It would release the entity inside, but at least it would do so in a controlled way, all at once, rather than letting it bleed out slowly over months. The entity would die, but the surrounding area would survive. And the other 6 sites would remain sealed, for now. But Miss Maddix Rowen, you need to understand something. If you destroy that stone, you're killing a living, conscious being, one that's been in stasis for millennia, one that's completely innocent of any wrongdoing. It's murder in every sense except the legal one. I understand, Rowen said, though her voice was hollow. I hope you do, because you might have to make that choice sooner than you think. Stay safe. Stay in contact. And whatever you do, don't let TerraVault take that site. The line went dead. Rowen set down the phone and stared at her hands. Her grandmother had carried this burden for decades, had made these impossible choices, held these terrible secrets, sacrificed her health and possibly her life to protect things most people would never know existed. And now it was Rowen's turn. Outside in the distance, she heard the sound of a helicopter. Rowen spent the next day preparing for war. She'd told herself years ago that she was done with combat, done with the tactical thinking and the controlled violence that had defined so much of her early life. But some skills never really leave you. They just wait, patient and quiet, until you need them again. She moved her most important supplies to a cache a mile from the cabin, buried in a waterproof container where only she could find it. Food, water purification tablets, ammunition, first aid supplies, and her grandmother's materials. If she had to abandon the cabin, she'd at least have resources to fall back on. Then she set up observation points, 3 of them positioned to give her sightlines on the main approaches to the stone. She couldn't defend the site directly, not against the kind of resources Terravolt could bring to bear, but she could monitor it, know when they arrived, maybe buy herself enough time to respond. The helicopter she'd heard had passed over twice more, flying a search pattern. They were looking for the drone, probably, or trying to pinpoint the exact location of the stone now that their aerial surveillance was down. It wouldn't take them long. On the 3rd day, she decided to check the stone again. The seal she'd applied was only meant to be temporary, and she needed to know how well it was holding. Brisk went with her, but reluctantly. He'd grown more nervous as the days passed, and now he walked pressed against her leg, ears back, every muscle tense. She understood. She felt it too, that sense of wrongness, of reality being twisted slowly out of true. The stone was worse, much worse. Her blood seal had failed, not completely, but enough. The gap had widened again, and now there was something pushing from inside. She could see it moving in the darkness, beyond the crystalline formations. The central mass she'd glimpsed before had grown substantially, and it was no longer stationary. It pulsed and shifted, pressing against the interior walls of the stone, testing them, and the ground. The dead zone around the stone had expanded to nearly 40 feet now. Within that circle, nothing lived. The earth itself had changed texture, becoming almost glassy in places, as if it was being converted into something else at a molecular level. Rowen stood at the edge of the dead zone and felt the thing inside the stone reach out to her, not physically, not with sound, but with something that bypassed her normal senses entirely and touched the part of her brain that processed awareness itself. Images flooded her mind. Not the visions she'd experienced before, but something more immediate, more desperate. She saw, felt, experienced a consciousness that was vast and ancient and utterly alien. It had been asleep for so long that sleep had become its reality, and waking was agony. It didn't want to be here, didn't want to exist in this frequency of space-time where everything vibrated wrong and hurt to perceive. It wanted to go back, wanted the sleep, wanted the peace of unconsciousness. But something had woken it. Something had cracked the vessel that held it, and now it was emerging whether it wanted to or not, and it was terrified. Rowen gasped and fell to her knees, the contact breaking. Her head pounded, her vision swam, and for a moment she thought she might be sick. Brisk whined and pushed against her, and she held onto him until the world steadied. The thing in the stone wasn't a monster. It was a prisoner, or maybe a refugee, like Chen had said. Something that had been put to sleep because existing here was torture, and she'd woken it up. She stood on shaking legs and looked at the stone with new understanding. Her grandmother had died protecting these things. Not because they were dangerous in the way people usually meant that word, but because they were vulnerable. Because letting them wake prematurely was cruelty on a scale Rowen couldn't fully comprehend. And because once they woke fully, once they tried to exist in this reality for any length of time, they would suffer. And that suffering would bleed outward, affecting everything around them, the land, the animals, the people. Not out of malice, but simply because their consciousness wasn't compatible with this world. The right thing would be to seal it again, properly this time, or failing that, to destroy the stone and end its suffering quickly. But as she reached for the materials in her pack, she heard voices. She dropped low instinctively, pulling Brisk down beside her, and watched as 3 people emerged from the forest on the far side of the clearing. 2 men and a woman, all wearing outdoor gear that was too clean, too new, corporate surveyors trying to look like hikers. The woman had equipment, handheld sensors, a tablet computer, something that might have been a sample collection kit. She walked directly toward the stone without hesitation, which meant they'd been tracking it for a while. Knew exactly where it was. "Thermal signature is off the charts," she said, reading from her tablet. "Whatever's inside is definitely active now. We should be able to get samples. Command wants us to wait for the containment team," one of the men said. "Containment team isn't here," the woman replied. "And every hour we delay is an hour. The competition could beat us to the other sites. We take samples now, analyze them, and by the time the suits arrive, we'll have actionable data." Rowen watched them approach the stone, watched the woman pull out tools that looked disturbingly like what Rowen herself had used to cut it open. They were going to widen the gap, going to expose whatever was inside to more of this reality's harmful frequency. She should stop them, should reveal herself, warn them, explain what they were about to do. But what would they believe? Corporate surveyors working for a company that saw only profit wouldn't listen to a woman living alone in the woods talking about alien refugees and incompatible consciousness. And if she revealed herself now, she'd lose any tactical advantage. They'd know she was here, would bring more people, make it impossible for her to do what needed to be done. So she watched. The woman knelt beside the stone, examined the gap, then positioned her cutting tool, a small rotary saw with a diamond blade. The whine of the motor cut through the clearing as she began to widen the opening Rowen had made. The stone's humming changed frequency immediately, rose in pitch. The light inside brightened, pulsed faster. The woman didn't seem to notice. She was focused on her cut, on getting through the hardened resin of Rowen's seal. When the blade broke through, everything happened at once. The gap exploded outward, not violently, not with force, but with a wave of that blue-green light that washed over the clearing like water. The 3 surveyors stumbled backward, crying out, their hands going to their heads as if in pain. The woman who'd been cutting screamed, not fear, something worse, something that spoke of minds being touched by things they were never meant to perceive. She collapsed. The 2 men were backing away, still screaming, hands pressed to their temples. One of them fell. The other turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush with no thought for direction or safety. And the stone, the thing inside, was emerging, not physically, not yet, but its consciousness was bleeding out through the widened gap, spreading across the clearing like invisible fire. Rowen could feel it reaching, desperate and blind and in agony. She had seconds to make a choice. She could try to seal it again, use more blood, more of her grandmother's materials, attempt to contain what was spilling out, but her seal had failed once, would fail again. This was beyond her ability to control now. Or she could destroy it, end the entity's suffering, and stop the contamination from spreading further. It would mean killing something innocent, something that had survived for millennia, only to die because she'd been curious and careless. But if she didn't, if this continued, the contamination would spread, would affect miles of forest, possibly reach populated areas, would cause suffering on a scale she couldn't imagine. Rowen reached into her pack and pulled out the second pouch her grandmother had left her, the one she hadn't opened yet, the one labeled Final Protocol. Inside was a single item, a glass sphere no larger than a marble, filled with something that looked like quicksilver, and instructions written in her grandmother's shaking hand: place at the convergence point, break the seal, run. The convergence point Rowen understood immediately. The center of the stone, where all those vein-like channels met, where the entity itself resided. It would mean getting close, getting inside the dead zone, exposing herself to whatever was bleeding out of that gap. But it would work, would destroy the stone and everything in it, would end this. She looked at Brisk, "Stay here. Do not follow me." He whined but obeyed, sitting as she'd trained him, though every line of his body vibrated with the urge to chase after her. Rowen stood, sphere in hand, and walked toward the stone. The moment she crossed into the dead zone, she felt it. The entity's consciousness crashed into her like a wave, and suddenly she was experiencing its reality perception that existed in dimensions she didn't have senses for. Thought processes that operated on frequencies her brain wasn't designed to interpret. She saw time as a physical dimension she could move through, saw space as something fluid and malleable, saw the barriers between possible and impossible dissolving under the sheer weight of perspectives she couldn't reconcile. She fell, got up, kept walking. Blood ran from her nose, her ears. Her hands shook so badly she nearly dropped the sphere. The stone was right there. The gap was wide enough now. She could see inside, see the crystalline chamber, see the dark, organic mass at its center, pulsing with distress. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." She threw the sphere through the gap. It took 3 seconds to fall the distance, 3 seconds of people watching it tumble through the blue-green light. 3 seconds of feeling the entity realize what was about to happen. It didn't fight, didn't resist. She felt its response like a thought spoken directly into her mind. "Thank you." Then the sphere hit the convergence point and shattered. Rowen turned and ran. The explosion wasn't fire or force. It was light and sound, and something else, a pulse of energy that traveled through the air and the ground simultaneously, rippling outward from the stone in waves that Rowen felt in her bones and her teeth and the spaces between her thoughts. She was 50 feet away when it hit her. The world went white, silent, and for a moment that stretched impossibly long, she felt absolutely nothing. Then sensation returned in a rush, her face pressed into moss, her lungs burning, Brisk's frantic barking somewhere nearby. She pushed herself up on shaking arms and looked back. The stone was gone, not destroyed, not shattered, but simply gone. Where it had been was now a crater maybe 10 feet deep, the edges smooth and glassy, as if the earth had been melted and then instantly cooled. And at the center of that crater, something was happening. The air shimmered, folded in on itself. Reality was doing something there that reality wasn't supposed to do. Rowen got to her feet and stumbled away, every instinct screaming at her to put distance between herself and whatever was happening in that crater. She found Brisk pressed against a tree, shaking but unharmed. Together they retreated to the tree line and watched. The shimmer resolved into an image. No, not an image. A projection, a recording. 3-dimensional and perfectly clear, hovering above the crater like a ghost. Her grandmother. But not her grandmother as Rowen remembered her, not the old woman who died 30 years ago. This was her grandmother, young, maybe in her 40s, standing in what looked like this exact spot, and she was speaking. "If you're seeing this, Rowen, then you've done what I hoped you'd never have to do. You've ended one of the sleepers. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I left this burden for you." Her grandmother's image flickered, stabilized. "But if you had to do it, then something has gone terribly wrong. The awakening shouldn't have started yet. Not for another 20 years at least. Someone must have interfered." Rowen's hands clenched into fists. Her grandmother had known, had predicted this exact scenario. The projection continued. "What I'm about to tell you is going to be hard to accept. I struggled with it for most of my life. The sleepers, the beings in the stones, they're not from another world. They're from this one, from Earth, but from a different time, a different version of what Earth became." The background behind her grandmother's image changed, showing scenes Rowen had glimpsed in her visions. Those impossibly tall trees, that purple sky, those strange figures moving between the trunks. 13,000 years ago, humanity wasn't the dominant species on this planet. We were here, yes, but we were young, primitive, living in small tribes, barely surviving. But there was another intelligence, something that had evolved alongside us, but in a completely different direction. They called themselves... Her grandmother spoke a word that Rowen's ears couldn't quite capture, that seemed to slide off her perception. But we can call them the predecessors. They built a civilization we can barely imagine, worked with biology and consciousness the way we work with stone and metal, but they made a mistake. They pushed their evolution too far, too fast, changed themselves at a fundamental level. And what they became was incompatible with the baseline reality of this world. The images showed cities that looked grown rather than built, structures that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, and figures that weren't quite the same shape from moment to moment, as if they existed in a state of constant transformation. They were dying, her grandmother said. Their own advancement was killing them. Every day they existed in this reality was agony. They tried everything they could think of to reverse it, to go back, but you can't unevolve. Can't undo changes made at the level of fundamental consciousness. So they did the only thing they could. They went to sleep. Built containment vessels, the stones that would hold them in stasis while the world moved on without them. They hoped that eventually reality itself would evolve, that the frequency of the universe would shift enough that they could wake and exist without pain. They've been waiting for 13,000 years, and the time is almost here. The stones are programmed to wake them in sequence, gently, allowing their consciousness to acclimate slowly to the current state of reality. The dates I left you, those are the proper awakening times. If the sequence is followed, if nothing disrupts it, they can wake and exist here. They can finally stop suffering. Rowen's throat was tight. She'd killed one. Ended 13,000 years of waiting because she'd been curious and careless. But her grandmother's projection wasn't finished. But if the stones are opened prematurely, if the sequence is disrupted, then the predecessors wake too soon. Their consciousness bleeds out into a reality that still can't hold them, and they suffer. And they die slowly, in agony, contaminating everything around them as their incompatible existence distorts the fabric of space-time. Rowen, I died trying to prevent this. 30 years ago, a corporation TerraVault, though they had a different name, then found one of the stones, tried to open it. I stopped them, but the effort cost me everything. The stones are connected, you see. The 7 form a network. Damage one, and the others feel it. Heal one, and you strengthen them all. I sealed the stone they'd damaged, but doing so required giving. Part of myself to the seal. Part of my life, my health, my years. The image of her grandmother wavered, and when it resolved, she looked older. Tired. I don't have much time left. The cost of sealing that stone is killing me, but it was worth it. I bought the predecessors 20 more years. Time for the universe to shift just a little bit more in their favor. But now, you've had to destroy one. And if you're destroying them, it means someone is trying to open them before their time. It means TerraVault or someone like them has returned, is trying to weaponize consciousness they don't understand. Her grandmother's face hardened. Don't let them. Whatever it takes. Don't let them open the other stones. If you have to destroy them all, do it. It's mercy, Rowen. Quick death instead of slow torture. The predecessors would understand. They'd choose it themselves if they could. The background changed again, showing a map. The same map Rowen had found in the trunk, but animated now, with markers showing the locations of all 7 stones. But if you can, if there's any way, seal them instead. Keep them closed until their proper time. The network is weakening with each stone that's destroyed. 6 stones is the minimum required for the awakening to work. Lose more than one, and the others will never wake properly. They'll die in their sleep, never knowing that their wait was almost over. I've left you everything I know, all my tools, my research, my contacts among the Guardian families. Use them. Trust Thomas Pine, he was my student, and he understands. There are others too, scattered across the country, descendants of the people who agreed to watch over the stones 13,000 years ago. They'll help if you ask. Her grandmother's image flickered again, and now she looked like the woman Rowen remembered, old, sick, tired beyond measure. "I'm sorry I couldn't tell you this when I was alive. Sorry I let you think these were just stories. But I hoped I hoped you'd never need to know. Hoped the stones would wake on schedule and you could live your life in peace. But you have my blood, my gifts, my responsibilities. And I know you're strong enough to carry them. You always were, even when you didn't believe it yourself." The projection began to fade. "One last thing. The stone you destroyed, it wasn't empty when it died. The predecessor inside was named, again, that word that slipped off perception. And it lived for 70,000 years before being sealed. It was a teacher, a healer, a parent to dozens of young. It chose sleep over death because it hoped to see its children wake and thrive in a world that had finally changed enough to hold them. You killed it, but you also ended its suffering. Sometimes that's all we can do. Sometimes mercy looks like murder." Her grandmother's image smiled, sad and infinitely tired. "I'm proud of you, Rowen. Whatever choice you make from here, I'm proud. You're the last guardian of the sleepers. What happens to them now is in your hands." The projection vanished. The crater where the stone had been was just a crater now, glassy and empty, and somehow final. Rowen stood there for a long time, staring at nothing, processing what she'd learned. 13,000 years, an entire species waiting to wake, and she'd just killed one of the last 7, but she'd also stopped it from suffering, from contaminating the forest and spreading its incompatible consciousness like a disease. She'd done what her grandmother would have done, what had to be done. The question was, what came next? She still had 6 stones, 6 predecessors waiting in their sleep, and somewhere out there, Terravolt was moving on the other sites, trying to open them, trying to extract and weaponize consciousness that was never meant to be touched. She couldn't let that happen. Couldn't let them wake the sleepers prematurely and cause the slow, agonizing death her grandmother had described. But she also couldn't destroy them all. 6 was the minimum. Lose one more, and the entire network would fail. The predecessors would die in their sleep after 13,000 years of waiting, never knowing how close they'd come. So she'd have to seal them. All 6. Keep them protected until their proper awakening time, now just weeks away according to her grandmother's schedule, which meant going to each site, facing Terravolt at every location, using her grandmother's methods to seal stones that were beginning to wake. It would probably kill her. The effort had killed her grandmother, and she'd only sealed one. But what choice did Rowen have? She looked down at Brisk, who watched her with patient, trusting eyes. Then she looked at the forest around her, at the dead zone that was already beginning to heal now that the stone's influence was gone. "Come on," she said. "We have work to do." They headed back toward the cabin. Behind them, in the clearing, the 2 Terravolt surveyors who'd survived were starting to wake. They'd have no memory of what happened, no understanding of what they'd witnessed. The contamination from the predecessor's consciousness would fade now, leaving only vague nightmares and a persistent unease about certain frequencies of sound. But they'd report back, would tell Terravolt that something had happened at the site, that the stone was gone, and Terravolt would mobilize, would move on the other locations with everything they had. Rowen had maybe a day, maybe 2. Then the race would begin in earnest, and she was determined to win it. Rowen spent the rest of the day emptying her cabin of anything she might need. The Guardian's kit her grandmother had hidden beneath the floorboards contained more than she'd initially realized. Tools for sealing, weapons for defending, maps showing not just the stone locations but also approach routes, safe houses, supply caches that the Guardian families had maintained for generations, and protocols. 2 sets of detailed instructions, handwritten by her grandmother in the months before her death. Protocol Alpha, Seal the stones permanently using a compound that required blood from a guardian bloodline, specific herbs that took weeks to prepare, and a ritual that would drain the person performing it. Her grandmother's notes were explicit about the cost. Each sealing would take years off the guardian's life. 7 sealings performed rapidly, one after another, would be fatal. The body simply couldn't sustain that level of sacrifice. Protocol Omega. Destroy all 7 stones simultaneously to prevent partial awakening. This required placing synchronized charges at each site, carefully calibrated to detonate within microseconds of each other. Quick death for the predecessors, mercy, but also the end of 13,000 years of hope. Rowen laid out the materials for Protocol Alpha. The compound was already prepared. Her grandmother had left 6 doses, one for each remaining stone. The herbs were dried and preserved. The instructions were clear. All she needed was her blood and her will. And time. Each sealing required approximately 4 hours to perform properly. 6 stones meant 24 hours of continuous work if everything went perfectly. But the stones were spread across 3 states, some of them in locations that would take days to reach, even by the most direct route. She studied her grandmother's map, tracing possible routes with her finger. If she moved fast, used her truck for the accessible sites, and hiked for the remote ones, she could potentially reach all 6 within 72 hours. But that assumed no interference. No TerraVault personnel blocking her access, no mechanical failures or weather problems, or any of the 1,000 things that could go wrong when you were racing against a countdown you didn't fully understand. Her phone buzzed. Thomas Pine, finally calling back. "Rowen, are you safe? For now, I destroyed the first stone." Silence. Then, "You had no choice." "None." TerraVault personnel tried to open it wider. The contamination was spreading. It was destroy it or let it cause more suffering. "Then you did right." His voice was heavy. "But you understand what this means? 6 stones left, minimum required for the awakening to work." She looked at the map. "I need to seal them all, keep them protected until their proper time." "Rowen, that's..." He paused. "Your grandmother nearly died sealing 1 stone. You're talking about sealing 6. I know the cost." "Do you?" Thomas's voice sharpened. "Do you really? Because I watched your grandmother waste away after she performed that sealing. Watched her age 10 years in the space of 6 months. The protocol doesn't just take years from your life, it takes them from the end, but you experience the aging immediately. Your body pays the price all at once." Rowen looked at her hands, strong hands, capable. She was 63, but she was fit, healthy, strong for her age. "How long would I have?" "After sealing 6 stones?" Thomas was quiet for a moment. "Months. Maybe a year if you're lucky. The compound you use for sealing, it's not just herbs and blood, it's a genetic trigger. It activates something in the guardian bloodline that allows us to interface with the stones, to communicate with the predecessor's consciousness at a level that lets us repair the containment. But that activation burns through your telomeres, accelerates cellular aging, degrades your DNA. You're saying it's poison. I'm saying it's sacrifice. The kind our ancestors agreed to 13,000 years ago when they accepted the responsibility of watching over the sleepers." Rowen thought about her grandmother, about the way she'd looked in those final months, frail and tired, and so much older than her years should have made her. She'd thought it was just age, just the natural decline of an old woman. But it had been this, the cost of keeping a promise made by people who'd been dead for millennia. "The others," she said, "the guardian families you mentioned, can they help?" "We're trying. I've reached out to everyone I could contact. But Rowen, there aren't many of us left. The bloodlines have thinned over the generations. Intermarriage with people outside the guardian families, children who chose not to have kids of their own, bloodlines that just ended. Of the 7 original families, only 3 still have living members, with the genetic markers necessary to perform the sealing. 3 families. How many people? 9, including you. And most of them are scattered across the country. It would take days to gather everyone, and we don't have days. TerraVault is already mobilizing. They've got teams moving on all the remaining sites. They'll reach at least 2 of them before we could possibly coordinate a response. Rowen felt the weight of it settle on her shoulders. 9 people to protect 6 stones, from a corporation with unlimited resources and no moral constraints. 9 people to prevent the premature awakening of beings whose suffering would contaminate everything around them. "What do I do?" she asked. "You're closest to 3 of the sites," Thomas said. "The Singer, 40 miles east of you. The Watcher, 60 miles south. The Dreamer, maybe 80 miles northwest. If you move now, you might be able to seal those 3 before TerraVault gets there. The others will handle them. I'm coordinating with the other families. We'll split up, cover as many sites as we can. And if we can't seal them all, then we implement Protocol Omega. Destroy them all at once. It's not what we want, but it's better than letting TerraVault weaponize predecessor consciousness." Thomas paused. "Your grandmother prepared Deadman switches at each site, charges that can be activated remotely. If it comes to that, if there's no other choice, we can end it quickly. Mercy killing." "Yes." Rowen looked at Brisk, who lay by the door watching her with patient eyes. She thought about the predecessor she'd killed, the gratitude she'd felt from it in those final moments. "Thank you," it had communicated. "Thank you for ending the suffering." Maybe that was what this all came down to. Not about winning or losing, not about success or failure, but about choosing between different kinds of mercy. The mercy of letting ancient beings finally wake after 13,000 years of sleep, or the mercy of ending their wait before the suffering began. "I'll seal the 3 closest sites," she said. "Send me the exact coordinates, Rowen." Thomas's voice was gentle. "When this is over, if we succeed, you understand, you won't have much time left. The cost of 3 sealings alone, I understand." She did. Accepted it the way she'd accepted every other hard truth in her life. Some things were worth dying for. Some burdens couldn't be passed on. "Send me the coordinates. And Thomas, thank you for carrying this with my grandmother, for not letting her face it alone. She was a great woman," Thomas said quietly. "And so are you." The line went dead. Moments later, her phone pinged with incoming data, GPS coordinates for 3 sites, detailed approaches, notes about what to expect at each location. Rowen packed methodically. The sealing compounds, carefully wrapped and protected, the herbs, the blade, the instructions, her camping gear, enough food and water for 3 days. Ammunition, first aid supplies, everything she might need to survive 3 days in the wilderness while performing rituals that would age her body decades. She paused at her bookshelf, running her hand along the spines of books she'd read dozens of times. Would she make it back here? Would she see this cabin again, sit on that porch, watch the morning light filter through the Douglas firs? Probably not. Even if she survived the sealings, even if TerraVault didn't kill her, the cost would be too high. She'd be too weak, too aged, too broken to make the journey back. She'd die somewhere out there in the mountains, and maybe that was fitting. Maybe that was what this life had always been building toward. She grabbed her truck keys and headed for the door. Brisk stood up immediately, tail wagging, ready to follow. "No," she said, kneeling in front of him. "Not this time, boy. This one I have to do alone." He whined, pushed his head against her chest. She held him, breathing in the familiar smell of his fur, feeling the solid warmth of his body. "You stay here," she said. "Guard the cabin. I'll come back if I can. But if I don't," her voice caught, "if I don't, you're a good dog, the best. And you deserve better than dying in the mountains because I was too stubborn to play it safe." She stood and walked out the door before she could change her mind, locked it behind her, got in her truck and started the engine. Brisk barked from inside the cabin, scratched at the floor. door. She could hear him even over the engine noise. But she put the truck in gear and drove away, watching in the rearview mirror as her cabin, her home for 40 years, disappeared behind the trees. The first sight was 40 miles east. She'd be there by nightfall, would perform the sealing under the stars, alone in the wilderness, giving years of her life to protect beings she'd never meet. Beings whose existence most humans would never know about. Her grandmother would be proud. That thought carried her down the mountain, onto the old logging roads, heading east into the last light of the dying day. Behind her, the sun set over the mountains she'd called home. Ahead, the stars began to emerge, cold and distant and indifferent to the dramas of the creatures crawling across the earth below. Somewhere out there, Terravolt was moving, bringing their resources, their technology, their absolute certainty that what they were doing was progress rather than catastrophe, and somewhere out there, 5 more predecessors waited in their stones, dreaming dreams of a world that had moved on without them, hoping that when they woke, it would finally be time, finally be home. Rowen tightened her grip on the steering wheel and drove faster. The race had begun. The singer was exactly where Thomas said it would be, in a narrow valley between 2 ridges, half buried under a rockslide that looked recent but was probably centuries old. Rowen reached it just as true darkness fell, and the stone was already showing signs of activation. It glowed, faintly but unmistakably, blue-green light seeping between the rocks that covered it. And it made a sound not quite singing, but a tonal hum that rose and fell in patterns that felt almost like language, like the stone itself was trying to communicate something it didn't have the means to express. She worked quickly, clearing rocks away from the surface, exposing enough of the stone to perform the sealing. The ritual required direct contact with the stone's surface and access to the convergence point where the internal channels met. She cut her palm first, the same palm she'd cut before. The wound barely healed. Fresh blood welled up, dark in the moonlight. She mixed it with the compound her grandmother had prepared, creating a paste that felt warm and almost alive in her hands. The herbs came next. She burned them in a small bundle, letting the smoke drift across the stone surface while she spoke the words her grandmother had written. They still felt wrong in her mouth, angular and harsh, but she spoke them with conviction, with purpose. The stone responded. The glow brightened momentarily, and she felt the consciousness inside stir. Not fully awake, not yet, but aware, questioning. She sent back reassurance as best she could. Sleep, rest, not yet time, soon, but not yet. Then she pressed the blood paste mixture against the convergence point and felt it sink into the stone, felt it travel along those internal channels, spreading through the structure, reinforcing the barriers that kept the predecessor contained and comfortable in its long sleep. And she felt the cost. It hit her all at once, a wave of exhaustion so profound she nearly collapsed. Her vision blurred, her hands shook, and when she looked down at them, they looked different, older, the skin rougher, more lined, the veins more prominent. She'd aged. Not dramatically, not decades, but enough to notice, enough to feel it in her bones and her breath and the way her heart labored in her chest. 1 down, 5 to go. She managed to get back to her truck, managed to drive another 20 miles before she had to stop and sleep. She pulled off onto an abandoned logging road and closed her eyes for what felt like seconds, but was actually 4 hours. When she woke, dawn was breaking, and her body ached in ways it hadn't ached before. Getting out of the truck took effort. Walking took concentration. She felt like she'd aged 5 years in a single night. But the singer was sealed, protected, safe to wait for its proper awakening time. She drove south, toward the Watcher, another 60 miles through mountain roads that tested her truck's suspension and her own endurance. She arrived mid-morning to find she wasn't alone. 3 Terravolt vehicles were already parked at the trailhead, Heavy trucks, expensive equipment, and somewhere up ahead on the trail, personnel who were probably already at the stone. Rowen grabbed her pack and her rifle and moved into the forest, circling wide to approach from an unexpected angle. Her military training kicked in: move quietly, stay in cover, never present a clear silhouette. Skills she'd thought she'd left behind 40 years ago, but they came back easily. Some things you never really forget. She could hear them before she saw them. Voices, equipment, the distinct sound of industrial drilling. They were trying to cut the stone open. She crept closer, using the terrain and the thick undergrowth for concealment until she had a clear view of the site. The watcher was larger than the singer had been, maybe 8 feet tall rather than 6, and it sat in a small clearing surrounded by old-growth cedar. TerraVault had set up a perimeter, portable lights, a generator, surveying equipment, and a drill rig that looked like it belonged in a mining operation rather than a wilderness area. 6 personnel that she could see. 2 operating the drill, 2 doing something with sensors and tablets, 2 more standing guard with what looked like automatic weapons, corporate security, trained, alert. Not people she could just walk past. And they were making progress. She could see the cut they'd made in the stone, could see blue-green light leaking from it, could feel even from here the disturbance in the air as the predecessor inside began to wake prematurely. She had to stop them, had to seal that stone before the contamination spread, but 6 armed personnel against one 63-year-old woman who was already exhausted from the previous sealing. Those were bad odds, even in her prime. She needed an advantage, something they wouldn't expect. She pulled out her satellite phone and called Thomas. "I'm at the Watcher site," she whispered. "TerraVault is already here. 6 personnel, heavy equipment, they're cutting into the stone. I need a distraction." "What kind of distraction?" "The legal kind. Call the Forest Service. Report illegal drilling operations on protected land. Bring rangers. Bring law enforcement. Bring anyone you can that will force them to stop and explain what they're doing. That'll take hours, maybe longer. Then I'll buy us hours." She looked at the TerraVault team, at their equipment, at the generator, powering their lights and their drill. "I'm going to make their job harder." She ended the call and moved through the forest, circling around to where they'd left their vehicles. No guards. Here they'd assumed the remote location was security enough. She slashed 3 tires on each truck, not enough to strand them completely, but enough to slow any quick exit. Then she found their fuel cans and dragged them away into the brush, hiding them where they wouldn't be easily found. Finally, she moved back toward the stone, approaching from the opposite side of their operation. She could still hear the drill, still see that contaminating light growing stronger. The predecessor inside was waking. She could feel its confusion, its pain, its desperate attempt to retreat back into sleep, but finding the barriers weakening with every cut TerraVault made. She had to act, now. Rowen stepped out of the forest with her rifle raised. "Step away from the stone," she said clearly. "All of you. Now." The guards reacted faster than she'd hoped. Both weapons came up, trained on her, and for a moment the clearing was frozen in a tableau of potential violence. "Who are you?" one of the guards demanded. "This is private property under lease agreement with the federal government. You're trespassing." "No lease agreement supersedes what's happening here," Rowen said, keeping her rifle steady even though her arms were starting to shake. "You're damaging something you don't understand. Something that can hurt a lot of people if you're not careful." The woman at the tablet Rowen recognized her from the first sight, the one who'd collapsed when the stone opened, stepped forward. Her face was pale, but her voice was steady. You were there before." "At the other site." "I was." "What happened to the stone?" "I destroyed it, before what was inside could contaminate the entire valley." Rowen shifted her aim slightly, just enough to remind everyone she was armed and capable. "Same thing I'll do here if you don't stop drilling." The woman's expression hardened. "You destroyed priceless archaeological evidence. Possibly the most significant discovery in human history. Do you have any idea what you've done? I know exactly what I've done. I've prevented suffering on a scale you can't imagine. And I'm about to do it again if you don't shut down that drill. I don't think so. The woman nodded to the guards. Disarm her. But before they could move, the stone pulsed. Not light this time sound. A deep, resonant tone that traveled through the ground and the air simultaneously, rattling equipment and making everyone in the clearing stagger. The drill bit shattered, just exploded, sending fragments of diamond-tipped metal flying. One piece hit the generator, which sparked and died, plunging the clearing into the blue-green glow from the stone itself. And the predecessor inside woke fully. Rowen felt it happen, that sudden expansion of consciousness, that reaching out in confusion and pain. The contamination spread like invisible fire, and everyone in the clearing felt it. The guards dropped their weapons, hands going to their heads. The drill operators fell to their knees. The woman with the tablet screamed, not in fear but in something worse, something that spoke of minds touching things they were never meant to perceive. Rowen felt it too, but she'd felt it before, had developed some resistance, some tolerance for the wrongness of predecessor consciousness bleeding into baseline reality. It still hurt, felt like ice picks being driven through her temples, but she could think through it. Could move. She ran to the stone, dropping her rifle, pulling out the sealing materials. Her hands shook so badly she nearly dropped the blood compound, but she forced herself steady. Cut her palm again the third time now, the wound refusing to heal properly, mixed her blood with the compound. The predecessor's consciousness crashed into hers, desperate and terrified. It didn't want to be awake, didn't want to exist in this frequency of reality where everything hurt. It wanted sleep, wanted peace, wanted to wait for the proper time. Rowen sent back reassurance. Apology, a promise that it could sleep again, that she would protect it until the right time came. She pressed the compound against the stone's convergence point and spoke the words. They came easier this time, as if her body was learning the rhythm, the pattern. The stone responded immediately, the glow dimming, the consciousness pulling back, retreating into the safety of stasis. The contamination faded, the wrongness lifted. The Teravolt personnel collapsed completely, unconscious or close to it, and Rowen felt the cost hit her like a physical blow. This time it was worse. Much worse. Her vision went grey at the edges. Her heart hammered irregularly in her chest. When she looked at her hands, they were unmistakably older, spotted with age, joints swollen, trembling with a palsy she couldn't control. She'd aged another decade. Maybe more. She was 70 now, or close to it. She could feel it in every cell of her body, every labored breath, every painful movement. 2 down, 4 to go. She stumbled away from the stone, away from the unconscious Teravolt personnel. They'd wake eventually, confused and terrified, with no clear memory of what had happened. The contamination did that scrambled short-term memory, left only nightmares and unease. She made it to her truck somehow, started the engine. The watcher was sealed, protected, safe. But she was running out of time, out of strength, out of life. Her phone showed messages from Thomas. The other Guardians had sealed 2 more sites, the Builder and the Speaker. That left 2. The Dreamer and the Keeper. She could reach 1 more. Maybe. If her body held out, if she could drive another 80 miles, hike another few miles, perform 1 more sealing. After that it wouldn't matter. She'd be too aged, too weak. Someone else would have to handle the final stone, or they'd implement Protocol Omega, destroy them all, but she could save 1 more, could protect 1 more predecessor, give it a chance to wake properly, to finally exist without pain. She put the truck in gear and drove northwest, toward the Dreamer, racing against her own mortality. Rowen made it to the Dreamer site 3 hours before dawn. She couldn't have told you how the drive was a blur of pain and exhaustion and sheer stubborn will. But when she pulled off onto the old forest road and saw the stone sitting in its hollow beneath a waterfall, she felt something like relief. This one was beautiful. Smaller than the others, smooth and perfect, with water running over its surface in sheets that caught the moonlight. It wasn't glowing yet, wasn't showing signs of premature awakening. Thomas had said the other guardians had bought them time by sealing the builder and the speaker. The network was stabilizing. One more sealing would secure it. Would protect the remaining predecessors long enough for their proper awakening time, now just weeks away. Rowen gathered, her materials with hands that barely functioned anymore. Everything hurt. Everything took twice as long as it should. She was old now, truly old, not just aged, but elderly, her body failing in ways that couldn't be ignored or pushed through by willpower alone. But she'd do this. One more. One last gift to beings who'd waited 13,000 years. She cut her palm for the 4th time. The blade slipped, cut deeper than she intended, and she watched blood flow dark and sluggish. Mixed it with the compound, burned the herbs, spoke the words that were becoming almost comfortable now, almost natural. The dreamer responded differently than the others. Where the singer had questioned and the watcher had feared, the dreamer felt curious, gentle. It had been sleeping so long that sleep and dream had become indistinguishable, and waking, even just barely, was more interesting than frightening. Rowen felt it reach out to her, felt it examine her consciousness with something like tenderness. It understood what she was doing, understood the sacrifice, and it was grateful. She pressed the compound against the convergence point and felt the sealing take hold. Felt the dreamer settle back into its protected sleep, content and secure, and trusting that when it woke properly, the world would finally be ready. The cost this time felt almost gentle, like slipping into warm water, like closing her eyes after a long, exhausting day. She aged, yes, another decade or more, but it didn't hurt the way the previous sealings had hurt. Maybe because the dreamer itself was easing the transition, making the sacrifice as painless as it could, or maybe she was just too tired to feel pain anymore. She sat down on the moss beside the stone and rested, just for a moment, just to catch her breath. Her phone buzzed. Thomas. "The keeper is sealed," his text read. "All 5 remaining sites are protected. We did it, Rowen. The predecessors will wake on schedule. You saved them." She smiled. Read the message 3 more times to make sure it was real. They'd done it. Against all odds. Against Teravolt's resources and the accelerated timeline and her own aging body. They'd protected the sleepers. In a few weeks, the stones would open naturally, and 5 predecessors would wake to a world that had finally evolved enough to hold them. They'd grieve for the 2 who'd died, the one she'd destroyed, and one other that had been damaged centuries ago and never recovered. But 5 would survive. 5 would get to see their children's children wake and thrive. Her grandmother would be proud. Rowen tried to stand, but her body wouldn't cooperate. She was too weak, too aged, too empty. The 4 sealings had taken everything she had to give, and then some. She'd bought the predecessors their future, but she'd spent her own to do it. She thought about calling for help, but what would be the point? By the time anyone arrived, she'd be gone. And honestly, this didn't seem like a bad place to die. Sitting beside a stone that held an ancient being's dreams, listening to water fall over rock, watching the sky lighten with approaching dawn. She thought about Brisk, alone in the cabin, hoped someone would find him, take care of him. He was a good dog, the best. He deserved better than she'd given him. She thought about her grandmother and Thomas and all the other guardians who'd carried this burden across the centuries. She was part of something larger now, part of a chain of sacrifice that stretched back 13,000 years and would continue forward however long it needed to. Her vision was fading, her breath coming slower. But she felt peaceful, complete. She'd lived alone for 40 years, convinced she was hiding from the world. Turned out she'd been preparing for this exact moment, learning the skills, hardening the resolve, positioning herself to be exactly where she needed to be when the time came. The sun broke over the ridge, spilling golden light across the valley. It touched the waterfall, turned the spray into rainbows. It touched the stone, made it shine like something precious. And it touched Rowen, warming her cooling skin, gentle as a blessing. She closed her eyes and thought of purple skies and impossible trees and beings who'd sacrificed everything for the chance that someday, somewhere, they might finally come home. "Thank you," she sent to them, to all of them, sleeping in their stones. "Thank you for waiting. Thank you for hoping. Thank you for trusting that we'd protect you." And from deep within the dreamer, in the last moments before consciousness faded entirely, she felt a response. "Thank you for the gift of time. Thank you for the gift of mercy. Thank you for carrying the burden when it wasn't yours to carry." Rowen Maddix died as the sun rose, sitting beside a stone that held ancient dreams, having saved a species that most humans would never know existed. She died alone but not lonely, tired but satisfied. Aged beyond her years, but young in the ways that mattered, still capable of sacrifice, still capable of hope, still capable of choosing mercy over safety. The predecessors would wake in 3 weeks, according to her grandmother's calculations. They'd emerge slowly, carefully, into a world that had finally shifted enough to hold them. They'd mourn their lost ones. They'd build new lives in the spaces humans had left for them, the deep forests, the high mountains, the quiet places where consciousness could expand in directions baseline humanity would never perceive. And they'd remember the guardians, remember the people who'd watched over them for 13,000 years. Remember Rowen Maddix especially, who'd given everything in the final days to ensure they had a future. In time, stories would be told. Not to humans, humans would never know, but among the predecessors themselves. Stories of the last guardian, the one who sealed 4 stones and destroyed one, who aged decades in days and died peacefully beside the dreamer's stone, having saved a world that would never thank her. Some battles are won in silence, some heroes never seek the light, but they're heroes nonetheless. And their sacrifices echo forward through time, shaping futures they'll never see, protecting lives they'll never know, ensuring that hope, that fragile, precious, essential hope, survives. Rowen had understood that, in the end, had accepted it, had chosen it freely, and in choosing it, had become exactly what her grandmother always knew she could be: a guardian, a protector, a bridge between what was and what could be. She died knowing she'd made a difference, that she'd mattered, that her life, lived in solitude and ended in sacrifice, had been worth something after all. The water kept falling over the stone, the sun kept rising, and deep beneath the moss and the earth and the barriers between one reality and another, the dreamer slept on, protected and safe, waiting for the day so close now, when waiting would finally be over.